Hello and welcome to Topic 6, Lecture 1. And in this topic, we're going to be learning about the Congress of the United States. All right, so Topic 6 is the start of the second unit for this class. The first unit was dedicated to looking at the foundations of American government, and now we are moving in to take a look at the institutions of American government, and we start with Congress. I want you to note that the Topic 6 is Chapter 12 in the textbook. So up to this point, the number of the chapters have corresponded with the number of the topics. That changes. So you're going to need to move forward in your textbook. Chapter 12 deals with the United States Congress. This is the last topic we cover before the midterm exam. You'll receive your midterm exam on the 26th. There will also be a study session on that day, and it will be recorded for those who cannot attend. And then the midterm exam is due on Sunday evening of October 30th. And so this, unit looks at the institutions of government, the federal legislative branch, which is the United States Congress, and then we move on to look at in future weeks, to look at the presidency and then to look at the federal judiciary. So in this lecture, we're going to provide an overview of the United States Congress and look at the differences between the House and the House of Representatives and the Senate. So let's go ahead and get started. So the lawmaking branch for the United States government is known as the United States Congress. And as we know from learning about the Constitution and the compromises that took place at the Constitutional Convention, the Congress is composed of two chambers. It is a bicameral institution. And the two chambers are the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Remember, this was the product of a compromise, that there was a disagreement at the Constitutional Convention that some of the states wanted our legislative branch to be more so-called democratic, one person, one vote, and so that the states that had a larger population got more of a say in the federal legislature. And so that we create these, as a product of this compromise at the Constitutional Convention, we have one a chamber that is based on population, and the other, the United States Senate, where each state gets an equal voice, okay? And that's a product of that compromise. The United States Congress is established by the Article 1 of the Constitution, and so Article 1 establishes the Congress, Article 2 establishes the presidency, and Article 3 establishes the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. And so those three articles compose the institutions of American government. And when I encourage you to take a look at Article 1 and reread it as we're working our way through Congress, and try to do that for each of as we move to the presidency, read Article 2. As we move to the judiciary, read Article 3. But in summary, Article 1 tells us how Congress is going to be designed. That is, that there's going to be two chambers. It tells us about the elections of the members and the qualifications for the members of Congress. It also talks about the process of lawmaking, and in Article 1, Section 8, it tells us what the powers of the federal Congress are. And so make sure you take a look at that as we move forward throughout the course of this topic. Members of the House are elected to what's known as a congressional district. There are 435 single-member districts throughout the United States. And the more populous your state is, the more congressional districts you get. Wisconsin has 8 congressional districts, compared to California, which is the most populous state in the union, has 52 congressional districts. And every state, regardless of its population, gets 1 congressional district. So there are 43 single-member districts. Each member represents a particular district within their state, okay? And so when you go to vote for the House of Representatives, you are voting for the person you want to represent the district that you live in. And we're going to be talking about that more in the next lecture. So there are 435 voting members. There are 6 non-voting members that represent the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and then also other territories within that are a part of the United States. Each voting member and non-voting member serves a 2-year term. And so they're up for re-election every 2 years, and there's no term limit. Your term is 2 years long, but you can be re-elected over and over and over. There are no limits to the number of terms you can serve. The House is more locally focused because members of the House represent a congressional district, and that congressional district has very specific needs. So compare a congressional district like the congressional district that Milwaukee is in. That congressional district is really focused on urban issues, whereas some of the congressional districts that are up north are focused more on rural issues. And so since you are elected by the members of the people who live in your district, that member of the House is going to be more attuned to those local issues. And that's true throughout the United States. There's more of a connection to voters because they're reelected every 2 years. And so members of the House, have to be careful about the decisions that they make because they're up for reelection real frequently. And so that is supposed to, at least in theory, make a closer connection to the people who are voting, the constituents who are voting for the members of the House. It's less prestigious. It's prestigious to be elected to the House of Representatives, but it's more prestigious to be one of the 100 members of the United States Senate. And as I mentioned, Wisconsin has 8 House districts. So as we know, representation in the United States Senate is not based on population. Each state gets equal representation. So as we know, each state gets 2 senators, regardless of how populous your state is, for a total of 100 senators. Obviously, that number changes over time depending on how many states that we have in the United States. The U.S. senators have a longer term, a much longer term. They serve a 6-year term. And so they, are not that they're less beholden to their constituents and their state, but a 6-year term is a long term. And so what you might do in the first year after getting elected or reelected, by the time you come up for reelection, voters might not be thinking about what you did in the first 2 years. And so there's less of a close connection, potentially, at least electorally, with the voters with the constituents. It's more prestigious to be in the House. It's a smaller, more deliberative body. It's also usually difficult to get elected to the Senate if you don't have a previous experience in government, either in the state legislature or in the House of Representatives. It's not impossible. Obviously, people without any public service qualifications do get elected to the Senate, but usually it's sort of seen as where you go to after serving in your state legislature or at the House of Representatives. It's also more national in focus and also more international in focus as well. Wisconsin has 2 senators, Tammy Baldwin, who's a Democrat, Ron Johnson, who is a Republican. What's unique and sort of illustrative of our senators is Ron Johnson is one of the most conservative senators in the United States Senate, and Tammy Baldwin is one of the most liberal senators. And so it's sort of odd that, our state, which obviously it's very purple, but it's sort of polarized in many ways. It's sort of, in many ways, sort of deeply blue on the one hand and deeply red on the other, as is illustrated by those 2 senators. And here's just a comparison between the differences between the House and the Senate, most of which we've already talked about. The qualification to serve in the House is you need to be 25 years as compared to 30 years. There's different qualification in terms of U.S. citizen, but you don't need to be born in the United States, obviously, to serve in the House or the Senate. You only have to be born in the United States to be elected president of the United States. And so make sure you take a look at that graph in your textbook. Okay, let's turn our sights now to just looking at the United States Congress and getting an understanding of why there are different sessions within Congress, a 2-year session, okay? And it's related to the terms of office for members of the Congress and also the elections that we have. Now, there is a lot of information in the textbook that we're not going to be getting to in lecture, and you are responsible for it. Make sure that you read about the legislative process. In other words, how a bill becomes a law. There will be a question on the midterm exam that you can choose to answer if you're interested in that. Make sure you also learn about the different leadership positions in Congress, as well as the role that political parties play in Congress as well. But this lecture in particular is just helping you get a base level sort of nuts and bolts understanding of Congress. Okay, so every 2 years there is a federal election, okay, that and they always take place on the even years, okay. So this year we have a federal election that's coming up. It's known as the midterm elections, and it takes place on November 8th, 2022. It's called the midterm elections because it's halfway through the term of the president. So Joe Biden was inaugurated in 2021. He will serve until 2025, and there will be another presidential election on November 5th, 2024. Okay. At the midterm elections, only members of the House and Senate are up for re-election. So all the members of the House are up for re-election in the midterm election because they have 2-year terms, and 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election since they have 6-year terms. And when the Constitution was crafted, they organized it so that 1/3 of the Senate was up for re-election at the very beginning, and then it continued on into the future. In the midterm election, the president will not be up for re-election, but a whole new Congress could potentially be elected at the midterm election days, as well as on the presidential election years, because again, you have all of the members of the House and 1/3 of the Senate up for re-election. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, that every 2 years, a new session of Congress begins. And each session of Congress is numbered since the first Congress in the United States. A session of Congress is 2 years long. Why? Because we have federal elections every 2 years. And so there's new people that are joining there are people that are not going to be reelected, or that they would have decided not to run for reelection. And there are other people that will be reelected to their position. So there's the potential that you get a new set of people every 2 years. And so when a new session of Congress begins, it gets a number. We're currently in the 117th Congress, and the 117th Congress started on January 3rd of 2021. And so that while the elections in the United States take place in November, the federal elections, the new members of Congress are not seated until January 3rd, and then they will serve until the new Congress takes over January 3rd of 2023. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the breakdown of the current congressional session, the 117th Congress. And so that right now, both of the chambers of Congress are in the hands of one party, as is the presidency. So it's unified government, and Americans don't like unified government, as we are going to find out in the midterm elections. And so that the majority, so you can see the breakdown there. There are 220 members who identify with the Democratic Party. There are 212 Republican members of the House of Representatives. And then there are 6 voting members and non-voting members and 3 vacancies. Okay. So it's a slim majority, but the Democrats have the majority in the House of Representatives. That it's a tie within the Senate. There are 48 Democratic senators. There are 50 Republican senators. And there are 2 independent senators, Angus King from Maine and Bernie Sanders from Vermont, but they both caucus with the Democrats, giving the Democrats 50 votes. The Democrats, even though it's 50-50, they still have the majority within the Senate, because if there's a tie in the Senate, the president of the Senate breaks that tie, and the president of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States. That's Kamala Harris, and she is obviously a Democrat. Okay. Now, this is likely to change potentially drastically in the upcoming midterm elections. Usually what happens at the midterm elections is whichever party is in power, they tend to lose seats at the midterm time. So it's very likely that the Republicans might take over both the House and the Senate. This year is a little different, in large part because of the decision in the Dobbs case that overturned Roe v. Wade. And so because of that, there's a lot of anger within the electorate, particularly among Democrats, but among some Republicans as well. And we're going to see whether or not that plays itself out in terms of making it more difficult for the Republicans to actually, have the wind at their back during midterms. And so keep your eyes open, and I'm sure I'll be posting about it as we get closer and after the midterm elections. Okay, thanks for listening, and we'll go on to the next lecture now.